Today we're going to cover 1.2 terrestrial biomes. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the global distribution and principal environmental aspects of terrestrial biomes. To accomplish this, we're going to first describe the 9 terrestrial biomes based on their climate and the type of organisms you can find there, and also describe the distribution of some of Earth's resources. Before we get into that, what exactly is a biome? So biomes are areas of the planet that can be classified based on their climate and those organisms that have adapted to live there. So biomes are larger than just an ecosystem. If you think of maybe your local ecosystem in your backyard, biomes are much larger and can even span continents. So we're going to look at their climate, so the temperature and the precipitation, and the organisms that live there. For example, if we think about what we would find in the desert, a cactus or a succulent is well adapted to living in that biome. So over here I've got a list of the terrestrial biomes we're going to look at today, and also a climatogram. So we're going to compare them based upon the precipitation. For this climatogram, it's in millimeters, and also the temperature here, it's in degrees Celsius. This is not always consistent, so make sure you're comparing like measurements if you get climatograms in your studies. So for these climatograms, precipitation is the bars at the bottom, and temperature is going to be the plotted line graph on the top. So let's get started. We're going to start by looking at the 4 different types of forests: the taiga or the boreal forest, the temperate rainforest, a temperate seasonal forest, and the tropical rainforest. Now, if you look at just these pictures, you'll notice there's a lot of similarities. They all have trees, but they're found in different locations. So our taiga is only found in really high latitudes up in Canada and Russia. The temperate rainforest is found along the coastlines of continents. It's really common around here in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. And the temperate seasonal forest is where we live here, found along the eastern United States, across Europe and parts of Asia, and then also the tropical rainforest, which is found in the southern hemisphere in South America, Western Africa, and Southeast Asia. Now, these are all types of forests, but they're all very different. So if we look at their climatograms, we can see some differences. So when we're talking about the word temperate here for our temperate rainforest and our temperate seasonal forests, these are places that are sort of like Goldilocks. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. They see moderate temperature changes. Our temperate seasonal forest over here typically has 4 seasons and sees pretty consistent rain seasonally. This is in contrast to the 2 extremes, the taiga, which sees a moderate amount of water, but it goes from very, very cold to slightly less cold. So it's pretty chilly in the taiga all the time, and this is in contrast to our tropical rainforest, which is very warm all the time. So if we look specifically at their temperatures and their amount of precipitation, the taiga is cold but has average precipitation. The temperate rainforest is cool and wet. The seasonal forest or deciduous forest is seasonal with average. That's our real Goldilocks one right there, sort of in the middle for all of them. And then the tropical rainforest, which is hot and wet all the time. So we go from cold to cool to seasonal to hot. And these guys all have, the rainforests are wet, our taiga and our temperate seasonal forest are average. In terms of biodiversity and the types of animals that are adapted here, our taiga is always cool, so these are animals that hibernate. They have a really short growing season, so it's pretty low biodiversity because you pretty much just have those conifer trees, those like Christmas trees. Our temperate rainforest is wet, has more biodiversity, but again, it's still pretty cool, so its growing season is not as great. Our temperate seasonal forest has a great growing season, really fertile soils because of those trees losing their leaves. So it has pretty decent biodiversity, and the tropical rainforest has the highest biodiversity of any of the terrestrial biomes we're going to look at. Because it is so warm year-round, lots of things can grow there, but the soil is not so great because of the fast growth of all the plants. So next we're going to look at the two grassland habitats, the temperate grassland and savanna. Just by looking at these pictures, we see there's some similarities. Most of the dominant species here are grasses, very few trees. Our temperate grassland is, in the United States, we call that the prairie, or you may have heard of it called the steppe in Russia. So this is found a lot in the central United States. It's found in southern Russia and a little bit in South America and Australia. In contrast, the savanna is found only in the southern hemisphere. If you've heard of the Serengeti, the huge savanna, found in Africa. It's also found a little bit in Australia, some in South America and India. So if we look at these two climatograms, we see some similarities. So the temperate grassland is like our temperate seasonal forest. It has seasons. It's a moderate temperature, so it gets cool or cold, depending on your feelings. In the winter, warmer summers. Has not a great amount of rain, but they do get some rain. Versus the savanna, which is hot all the time. And they get rain seasonally. So they have dry, hot summers. Remember, this is the southern hemisphere, so our summers are over here. And they have warm or cooler but wet winters. So they have a monsoon season. Next, we're going to look at the last three biomes. Now, this shrubland can kind of fit with the grasslands or the deserts, so I've put it with the deserts to show more contrast. Shrublands are found along the coastline of continents, so they're really affected by the ocean. They're found in California, right here in South America, a lot in the Mediterranean on the edge of Australia. Let's go back to the pictures for a second. The desert is found along 30 degrees north and south of the equator. You'll see there's not a lot of diversity going on here. And then we have the tundra, which is found at the extreme northern and southern latitudes. Tundra has very little life on it. It's very cold all the time. This is where our permafrost is, so that's the permanently frozen soil. Makes it very hard for things to grow. So when we look at the climatograms for these three, you'll notice that the desert and the tundra have virtually no precipitation. So the tundra is basically just a very cold desert. Our shrubland gets cool in the winter and warm in the summers, sort of like we saw in the grasslands, but gets a lot more rain or precipitation in the wintertime than it does in the summer. So this affects the type of life that we have adapted here. Shrubland has a lot of fires when it's hot and dry in the summer, so the plants there have adapted to needing that fire in order to grow. Our desert plants, as I mentioned earlier, are well adapted to no or low precipitation. So we've got cacti, we've got succulents. They can survive without a lot of water. And then our tundra, because it's so cold, there's virtually no growing season. Very little biodiversity in the desert and the tundra. And so plants in the tundra are very low and close to the ground because it's so cold. And they pretty much only grow at the very end of the summer. They're very shallow because the ground underneath them is frozen. So in addition to their location on the map, the latitude and the altitude affect the type of biome. So you may see all these biomes in an area that's very mountainous, so the altitude. If you have a tropical rainforest at a lower altitude, you can get up to the tundra and just plain ice and snow by moving higher in the altitude. So we see this in the latitudes, moving up in latitudes as we get to the poles. We go from rainy equator tropical rainforests up to the taiga and the Arctic tundra. These biomes are not consistent. The Earth is interconnected, so over time these biomes are going to change. You can see in this glacier here that from the 1940s to 2004, the area of the glacier is changing. In addition, we see over here that global warming could shift the wine regions, so as areas become warmer than they used to be, They can no longer support the same type of life, so their climate will change, the organisms adapted to that area change, and therefore the biome changes. So to summarize, we saw that there's different organisms and climate patterns for the biomes. These affect the types of resources we may find. So our resources could be water and trees for lumber, so our taiga and temperate rainforest are big areas where we cut down a lot of trees. It's where a lot of our lumber comes from. And these things are affected by the climate, the geography, the latitude, the altitude, nutrient availability, and soil.